Thank you very much for a very kind introduction. I just want to give you a little bit more background of where I come from and when I first set foot in Ireland. I hate microphones, by the way. At the beginning of 2001, when the Celtic Tiger had just ended and the housing boom was just getting underway. Before arriving in Ireland, I knew very little about it beyond what you'd get as an avid reader of The Economist, The New York Times, and Irish novelists from William Trevor to Sean O'Foylan up into Roddy Doyle. I'm an unhyphenated American, and I'm not of Irish descent. To me, Ireland had been a flyover country, much like the Midwestern state of Michigan, in which I lived for about at that point, about 20 years. So I came without strong preconceptions. Now, as an economist, I'm an applied theoretician, which means I leave numbers alone for the most part and let somebody else look at the empirical actuality of what happens. And my research career has been atypical in that my dissertation was on banking, and I did work in banking, but I've also done defense economics, health economics, environmental economics, as well as the economics of religion. So my analysis today of what brought Ireland to the state it's in now will therefore be a bit more holistic, and some would say sociological as opposed to economic, and deal with both the economic and spiritual flux of the past 3 decades. So, I'll begin in 1979 when Pope John Paul II visited Ireland. In his homily at the open-air Mass in the Phoenix Park, he warned the Irish people of the challenges of life in the late 20th century: materialism, affluence, self-indulgence, and consumerism. Yet the Irish to whom he was speaking were among the poorest in Europe. Materialism, affluence, consumerism, and self-indulgence were all things more dreamed of than actually experienced. Ireland, after all, was considered to be the sick man of Europe. The statistics well known to most are nevertheless staggering. GDP per capita was only 69% of the European average. Personal income tax rates were extortionate, topping out at 59%. Government debt was in excess of 100% of GNP. The cost of servicing that debt in 1985 was approximately 13% of GNP. In 1985, the real interest rate was 10.5%. Unemployment was 17.3%, and inflation was 5.4%. The exchange rate over the first half of the 80s was deemed to be significantly overvalued, which further crippled the economy. During the decade of the 1980s, 10% of the population emigrated. Those who emigrated were seeking a better quality of life, both for themselves and perhaps through remittances for those they left behind. The Church's admonitions notwithstanding, those of the Irish people who had not yet abandoned hope in their earthly purgatory yearned for a materially better quality of life. From the ashes of the 1980s, there arose a new Ireland. The miraculous transformation began around 1990. By 2000, Irish GDP per capita was at the European average. By 2003, Irish GDP per capita was 136% of the European average. This new Ireland was, in contrast to its predecessor, a prosperous country. It was a country of full employment with labor force participation rates of women increasing dramatically. Moreover, New Ireland's success attracted migrants from abroad, from China, from Africa, from the Middle East, from India, as well as from Europe and the US. These were the new Irish who came to settle in the new Ireland in pursuit of their dream of a better life. New Ireland was a country characterized by fiscal rectitude, with government debt at only about 33% of GDP. It was a country of peerless export-led growth. Ireland was also becoming a secular country, much more like its European counterparts, a materialistic country consumed with consumerism, in Mary McAleese's words, a self-indulgent country with household debt exceeding 100% of disposable income. New Ireland was affluent. New Ireland was envied and emulated. These sociological and economic changes were swift and pervasive. There was indeed a new Ireland, and it rightly reveled in what it had become. It did not mourn the old Ireland. No whiff of the grave clung to this new, exuberant, self-confident country. The resurrection of Ireland has been attributed to a number of factors, among which were sensible government policies which cut spending, borrowing, and taxes, falling interest rate, the small openness and flexibility of the economy, currency devaluation, and an ongoing favorable exchange rate, European Union subsidies, the European Union single market, FDI, which was enticed by low corporate tax rates and generous subsidies, a ready supply of high-skilled workers willing to work at competitive wages, a surge in labor force participation rates of both men and women, and social partnership. The miraculous growth of the Celtic Tiger area was fueled more by increased inputs than by increased productivity of existing inputs, but the growth was no less miraculous as a result of this. And it must be remembered that government actions and policies were instrumental in marshaling the resources, but the unique confluence of events that had made it possible could not be duplicated. So as the Celtic Tiger era ended in the dot-com recession of the early 2000s, the government could not rely on many of the sources of growth that led to New Ireland to guide the country into the new century. The demographic effect was largely spent. Skilled workers were now among the most expensive in Europe. Other countries had emulated the Irish model and improved their success rates at attracting FDI. EU subsidies disappeared as wealth rose. The single market effect is a one-off. And Ireland was now in the euro area and so had no independent control over its currency. This led the government with a much diminished policy toolkit. What it still had was taxation and expenditure policy to entice additional FDI and spur growth, and social partnership to promote social harmony and industrial peace, and to reinvent Ireland. The practice and rhetoric of social partnership are most interesting and important. Social partnership suggests that all, the unions, employers, the government, as well as representatives of the chambers of commerce, small and medium enterprises, farmers, community and voluntary groups, including representatives of the church, were in this project together. Perhaps they shared a vision of what New Ireland was and what it could be, or they felt as long as they were at the bargaining table, their voices could be heard and their vision of New Ireland would emerge as the true one, or since rapid economic growth enabled funds to flow to causes worthy and otherwise, presence mattered. Whatever the reason for each of these groups taking part, the rhetoric was and remained positive and inclusive. And on every government body, board, and group, the social partners were represented. While only the government, unions, and employers were directly involved in wage negotiations, the other groups lent their voices to discussions on social and economic policies. This meant that the triennial social partnership agreements and the infiltration of partnership into all aspects of Irish life represented a joint project in the development of New Ireland and defined what was special about the new Irish model. Clearly, the government was central to this, since by its ability to agree to public sector wage packages, it could set the tone and parameters for the private sector agreements. Further, it could influence the possible outcomes via its taxation and expenditure policies. It could also keep the community and voluntary sector sweet, both by listening and responding to their wants and needs. All this was possible so long as tax revenues continued to grow at a healthy rate. This broad process of wage and socioeconomic policy determination was one of inclusion. It was collaborative. It was us and us, rather than adversarial, us versus them. Its expressed goal was to make everyone better off and leave no one behind. It represented what was right and good about the Irish model. Social partnership made the Irish economy and the New Ireland different, an exemplar of what could be in a globalized, cutthroat, competitive world economy of the 21st century. The Irish people, like the Irish government, embraced New Ireland wholeheartedly. Ireland had finally met Mammon and liked what she saw. The materialism, affluence, consumerism, and self-indulgence that Pope John Paul II had warned against were celebrated. Conspicuous consumption became the norm. Profligacy was the order of the day, and the champagne flowed. The Irish leaped onto the property ladder at home and then added to their property portfolios with both domestic and foreign properties, either for investment purposes or just for someplace to go at the weekends to unwind. New cars choked the roads, and new roads were demanded to accommodate them. The banks financed these dreams even when a borrower's current income would not, in less bountiful times, have justified the loans. The boom was a rising tide that lifted all boats. Real incomes were growing across the income distribution. Clearly, the Celtic Tiger period was equivalent to Ireland having won the lottery. The poor were made rich essentially overnight. Those who had never had money to spend now had money, a good job, and good prospects. By any and all measures, the Irish were materially better off than they had ever been before. Amid abundance, past poverty was easily forgotten, and the idea of a future with less was not even countenanced. As the influence of mammon increased, that of the church fell. It was mired in child abuse scandals and so found it difficult to articulate a message from the moral high ground. Moreover, it was unable to effectively argue against the value of wealth in this life, since wealth in this life was accompanied by better health and well-being, even if spiritual sustenance was no longer valued or sought at its door. For too long had the Irish been promised the treasures of heaven to compensate them for the material deprivations of their lives here on earth. The treasures of earth now finally enjoyed were not to be disdained. The church, such an important feature in Ireland's past, was not a major player in the new Ireland. It no longer spoke to or for Ireland. As is well known, the Celtic Tiger era of high rates of export-led growth ended in about 2001 to be replaced by another era of high growth, this time fueled by low interest rates, an international liquidity glut, generous lending by banks to individual mortgage holders and property developers, and government tax policies which favored the property sector. At the beginning of this era, exchange rates were still favorable, buoying up the export sector. As the decade progressed, the euro strengthened against the other major world currencies, putting strain on the export sector. However, the property boom masked the potential for serious problems in the near term since the economy and tax revenues continued to grow. This revenue growth made all previous promises and then some new ones affordable while remaining or appearing to remain fiscally prudent. These brewing problems were either not recognized or dismissed, as are many inconvenient truths, by the government and the social partners until it was too late. The economic situation at the end of the Celtic Tiger era was one that should have raised concern. Average real hourly wages had risen by 20% over the decade of the 90s, outstripping productivity growth. By 2002, Irish workers were the third most expensive in Europe. They're now the second most expensive. New home construction and the accompanying bubble in new home prices led to substantial GDP growth, but the bubble hid the reality that productivity gains were an artifact of the bubble, not of increased productive efficiency. Further, the construction sector was crowding out the export sector and was leading to a degradation of workers' skills as young people opted for the high income promised in the construction sector rather than for higher education. It also hid the significant problems in the tax code. Revenues from transaction taxes such as capital gain and stamp duty on property, which would fall significantly as the property market slowed, whether to a soft landing or as a result of the bubble bursting, these tax revenues were going at a rate that allowed for further cuts to income tax rates and increases in various forms of tax relief. With tax revenues climbing and the economy growing, the impetus for change was weak. Times were still good, and the government could continue to support policies beloved of the social partners, which imposed obligations not only on the present, but in the future. And the government can continue to appear fiscally prudent, and it's disparaged those voices urging restraint, as well as those threatening Armageddon. The day of reckoning could be deferred. The voices questioning the sustainability of government policy and economic growth were not so sanguine. Early warnings came in 2001 from both the European Commission and the European Central Bank. They reprimanded Ireland for an overly inflationary fiscal policy. But then Finance Minister Charlie McCreevy refused to change the budget, and he received full support of the social partners for his defiance of Europe. The benchmarking exercise that increased public sector wages by an average of 9% above and beyond the increases agreed in the normal social partnership negotiations was also questioned, this time by academic and ESRI economists. The concern expressed was that these extraordinary wage increases would further diminish Irish competitiveness. Their warnings were largely dismissed as the moanings of dismal scientists or issues that could be deferred. The time was not yet ripe for hard decisions. Warnings can also be discerned in the National Competitiveness Council reports that reminded the government that to sustain growth, productivity had to continue to rise, and rise significantly faster than it had in the post-Celtic Tiger era. It suggested what was needed to keep Ireland on the straight and narrow, to enhance the gains made in the Celtic Tiger era. But as the reports also contained good news, it was that which was pointed to and commented upon. Also dismissed as unduly negative were the ever more strident warnings by academic economists, OECD researchers, The Economist magazine, and other members of the press that the construction boom was unsustainable. Moreover, that it would burst, leading inevitably to a crash in property prices and economic activity, since the construction sector then accounted for about 15% of employment. In addition, banks were overexposed to the property market, and when it slowed or collapsed, they too would face significant difficulties. And this was forcefully stated. But those voicing these opinions, no matter how they bolstered the opinions with careful econometric analysis or good old common sense, were chided, if not admonished, for scaremongering and talking down what was characterized as a robust and fundamentally sound economy. The government had its supporters in high places. The IMF, the OECD, even other articles in The Economist said all was well and the economy would just slide to a soft landing. For every contrary voice, there were many supporting voices. This allowed for hard decisions to continue to be put off, which brings us to essentially today. The Irish general election of 2007 returned Fianna Fáil to power as the party best able to shepherd the economy into the future. Continued, if slower, growth was promised, and the property sector was predicted to make a soft landing. As the celebrations, first of Bertie Ahern's retirement, then of Brian Cowan's elevation to Taoiseach, wound down, reality set in. The Irish economy, perhaps less exposed to the world financial woes, was critically overexposed to itself. The economy that had boomed by exporting to the world had again boomed by selling houses to itself at an unsustainable rate. New houses were in excess supply and sales were slumping. The world economy was in dire straits and the world financial system was closed for business. The essential tax revenues from stamp duty and capital gains taxes to fund the new Irish model had dried up. The tide had turned and the government was stranded. So the government was in a fix. Could it have averted this disaster? And the answer there is probably no. Could it have made it less of a disaster? And the answer here is definitely yes. Preparing for the inevitable rainy day when the sun is shining and all is right in the world is never an easy thing to do. What had been needed was an effective leader who could convince both his or her party and the electorate of the need to take hard and often unpalatable decisions, such as improving the tax code, increasing income tax rates both on firms and individuals, introducing property taxes based on property value, reducing reliance on transactions taxes, charging for water and water treatment, or imposing productivity-enhancing work rules on civil and public servants were all things that needed to be done. There's obviously more that needed to be done, and they could have been done at the beginning of the century, if there had been the will. And that's a big if. What was missing was not the desire by either the government or the people for a still better future, but the willingness to do the hard work and to make the sacrifices needed to get there, coupled with the unstated hope that someone else, the U.S. multinationals or the EU, would make the sacrifices unnecessary and would do the hard work instead. Hard work and sacrifice were not in the new Irish lexicon. The government had to face the crisis, and this crisis is not entirely of its own making. And it did so with the presumed support of the social partners and the Irish and this Irish model of the new Ireland to guide it. The message the government sent to the Irish public and to the members of the financial community was that New Ireland was strong and resilient enough to ride out this storm. Things were bad, that they'd been bad before, and the Irish had survived, and they would survive again. The troops would and could be rallied. But initial stumbles, such as revoking medical cards of the over 70s, strained the fabric of social partnership. This was not what had been signed up to. Sharing the gain was one thing, sharing the pain appeared to be quite another. Further strains rent the fabric as private sector workers took pay cuts and lost their jobs, while public sector workers were sheltered from the economic realities. Pension levies on the public sector carried little weight since private sector wages had already been significantly cut and the viability of many pension systems questioned. True, pain was being shared, but was the sharing rule equitable? The social fabric appears now to be in shreds as the reality of the McCarthy report hits home. While the government still calls on the social partners, both in the private sector and the public sector, to put their shoulders to the wheel and to work for a better future, what had underpinned social partnership has already been lost. There is no longer a common purpose, had there ever truly been one. Now that ever larger surpluses have been turned into ever larger deficits, social partnership has collapsed, leaving all individual groups looking out for number one. Now as the economy stumbles, slips, and falls, the church, which has also fallen from great heights of power and prosperity and still struggles to stand, counsels charity. Preaching from its humbled and diminished state, perhaps it will be heard by a humbled and diminished Ireland that may now fully take the hard, long-deferred decisions and choose to embrace a sustainable model of economic, social, and spiritual prosperity in the mature knowledge that life of an individual or of a nation does not consist in the abundance of one's possessions. Thank you.